Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, STEAM and DIA, offering informal learning with a mind toward diversity. I am Christine McNew, Youth Services Consultant for the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, and I am your moderator. I'd like to thank Naomi DiTullio, our Distance Learning Consultant, for taking care of the technical aspects of the webinar. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter. Amy Kuster is the Youth and Family Program Coordinator at the Skokie Public Library. She has presented on STEAM at conferences and workshops around the country, and she has written about STEAM for the ALSC blog, School Library Journal, and Children and Libraries. Amy shares her library programs and professional musings on her blog, The Show Me Librarian. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Amy.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you, Naomi, for getting us started. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're enjoying some nice weather from wherever you are watching this from. I'm currently just north of Chicago, where we're getting some good autumn stuff happening. So you'll see that love of autumn in the colors I've chosen for today's presentation. What we're really going to do today is focus on STEAM programming with a particular bent towards making sure what we're doing is inclusive and equitable so that we're keeping diversity, in particular multicultural diversity, in mind. So if we've not had the opportunity to meet virtually or in person before, you have a picture of me. Hi, I'm Amy. As mentioned, I work at the Skokie Public Library here just north of Chicago, where I oversee all programming for youth from babies through grade 5, plus family and multicultural events. For a couple of years now, I've been blogging as the Show Me Librarian, where I've put all sorts of full program plans and things online. I'm a big believer that if you create something and it works, and it might work well at other libraries, you share it. So I've got lots of stuff there. And kind of in conjunction with that, I recently wrote for ALSC, for the Association for Library Service to Children, a toolkit for their Building STEAM with DIA initiative. So I don't know if you've seen that yet. I will be mentioning it in the resources later on and mentioning where you can find that. So today we're going to be upfront talk a little bit about the background of STEAM, but more specifically how diversity factors in, because it's not necessarily intuitive to everyone who maybe doesn't have an educational type background. From there, we're going to do some starting points in thinking about creating original programs or program modifications that are going to make sure your STEAM programs are equitable. I'll share 3 different sample programs from start to finish for 3 different ages, preschool, K through 2, and 3 through 5. And then we'll wrap up with some 5 takeaway tips and resources on this topic. And we will have time at the end for some final questions, but I do have a couple of stopping points throughout the presentation where Christine's going to chime in and share any questions that are currently existing. So if I'm talking about something and a question pops into your head, please go ahead and type it. Christine is going to be moderating that, and when we get to a question portion, I will go ahead and answer. Without further ado, let's get started. So what is STEAM, and how does diversity fit into that conversation? Well, if any of you were able to attend or see the archived webinar that I gave a couple of weeks ago, STEAM, this will be familiar to you. So STEAM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And STEAM in libraries has been talked about in particular as it regarding programs and services that we're providing to patrons of all ages really, but my focus has predominantly been on children, a little bit of teens mixed in there, but a lot of children in particular. So STEAM activities are going to be anything that has some sort of tie to any of these 5 areas. What I do want to emphasize for clarity is that when we're talking about arts in STEAM, we're not really talking about arts and crafts or getting out the paints and the glue and the markers. What we're talking about is arts being a more acronym-friendly way of saying open-ended creativity, innovative thinking, problem solving. So we're looking at, with STEAM, it's having the skills and concept knowledge in science, technology, engineering, and math, and then being able to apply them, and that's kind of the artistic component. So where did this all come from? Starting in 1983, there was an article that was put out and shared with Congress talking about the state of education, in particular children's education in the United States, and as it compares to education worldwide. And this article in the early 80s, or the study, found that American children were performing significantly below their peers in a lot of subject areas, predominantly math and science, that were going to be the big areas of study and big areas of jobs and innovation worldwide in the future. So the study identified there is this gap, and this gap is a problem if we want Americans to stay at the forefront of innovation, at the forefront of business, the forefront of information. So a couple of years later, then President George H.W. Bush convened an education summit. That's, as far as I can tell, that's what it was called. Didn't have any more specific of a name. But he had governors from 50 states come to this summit, and that's where they really discussed this deficit that reports were seeing in American students' performances in science and math. And while they were there at this education summit, this group said, all right, well, if we're falling behind here, then we're going to set some very specific and concrete goals that are going to help us as Americans ensure that our children, our students, are going to be at the top in math and science across the world in a reasonably, brief time frame. So in the way that government works, that was 1989, these goals that were put forward by the Education Summit in 1989 and originally put forward, there were two ultimately added to create the Goals 2000 Act in 1994 with then President Bill Clinton, so it took about 5 years. And so this put into law that American students would be, by the year 2000, at the top in the world when it comes to math and to science. I don't know that it is necessarily any surprise to any of us here today that A, that was a lofty goal for only a 6-year turnaround period, and B, we did not reach it. So coming out of hitting that or passing that deadline, the year 2000, and still having American students performing behind where we ideally wanted them to be. So in 2001, that's when President George W. Bush put through No Child Left Behind. It was signed into law, became law in 2002. That focused again on education with a heavy emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and math specifically. So at this point, in the education community at least, we're starting to get more and more familiarity with this concept of STEM. So 2002, things start to change just a little bit. Mae Jemison, who was an astronaut, well, she was an astronaut, she's still alive. She's a physician, a dancer. She gave a TED Talk in 2002, talking specifically about arts and sciences as both being avatars of human creativity. So they're two sides of the same coin. And if we want to be successful in sciences and STEM, we need to have that arts, that innovative, creative aspect as well. So 2002, very shortly after the passing of No Child Left Behind, that's when we start to see this transition amongst people, not as much in education, but in business and STEM organizations and STEM higher education. That's when we start to see the shift from STEM to STEAM. So you may have noticed up until this point, there's been no real discussion that about these American students and whether or not they are underperforming and whether there are any demographic differences within that kind of range of underperforming as compared to worldwide peers. So In 2007, we have another report given to Congress, given to legislators, rising above the gathering storm, basically calling out this alarm again, saying, hey, we're falling behind, we need to do better, we need to stay at the top. But it wasn't until 2011, with another reiteration of, hey guys, we can do better, we need to do better, that the National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine actually put together and said, we're falling behind, or we are behind, but it's not equitable falling behind or being behind. In fact, there's huge discrepancy between how behind white American students are as compared to their worldwide peers, and how far behind underrepresented minority children are compared to worldwide peers. So this is 2011, so very recently. This is the first time we really start to see this concept of diversity, multicultural, racial, ethnic diversity, come into the concept, into our discussions of STEAM. And this is when, this is an important definition, this paper defined underrepresented minorities in STEM, or in STEAM, as persons who identify as Black or African American, Latino or Hispanic American, and American Indian First Nations people. So if a person identifies as white or a person identifies as Asian American, they're going to not be considered an underrepresented minority, but pretty much anyone else, including Pacific Islanders, Native Alaskans, they're underrepresented. So why is this important? The way I try and think about this is, throughout the life of a student, you start off kind of at the bottom of a ladder and you're a student, and then you go to school, and then you go to college, and then you get a job. And if we start at the top and kind of look down at what's feeding to that top of the ladder, this is where we can really see a problem. So at the top, when we're talking about STEM professions, minorities are underrepresented in STEM fields. So this data is from this the report that I mentioned from 2011, Expanding Underrepresented Minority Participation. So using data from the late aughts, they identified that even though Black or African Americans were about 13% of the U.S. population, they were only 4% of the STEM workforce. Similarly, the Latino population of the U.S. was about 15–16%, and only 7% of the workforce when it came to STEM. So pretty good underrepresentation, or I guess I should say pretty bad underrepresentation. But it gets much worse as we go a little bit further down that ladder and see how things are being fed. So if we have not a lot of people at the top, underrepresented minorities at the top of the STEM fields, there aren't that many in STEM education that are going to be able to feed into STEM fields. And we also see that in early education, in 4th grade, 8th grade, high school, minority students, their test scores in science and math in particular are consistently below those of their white peers. So even though from 1995 until recently, overall the average of math and science scores for American students has gone up, Black students still perform between 80 and 100 points below their white peers, and Latino students perform between 60 and 70 points. So there's a lot of inequity here, even amongst this kind of gap that we have nationally identified, which is saying American students are behind. So what does all of this mean? We know why it matters. We know what the numbers are. We know that it is an issue. How do we, as librarians, as people who try and provide informal education opportunities, how do we respond to this? So one thing that's really important to recognize is that this disproportionate underrepresentation, it's not about aptitude. It's not that one type of person is inherently smarter or better suited toward an activity than another. What it's about is a systemic difference in terms of the preparation, the access, and the motivation that the underrepresented minority groups are able to have when it comes to STEM and STEAM opportunities. So I want to unpack that a little bit, and now we're getting to where it's not just word slides, we're going to have some pictures too. So when it comes to preparation, one of the biggest things that we can do as libraries is make sure that we're providing early exposure for children to have opportunities to engage in STEAM learning, gain basic STEAM concepts and skills. So this is a picture from a human body preschool program that I did when I worked in Missouri. This is Brittany. She came to all of my preschool science programs, and she went to preschool. I mean, she did everything your typical 4 or 5-year-old would do, but in coming to these programs, and by the library offering these programs, we were making sure that children had access to preparation in these basic science concepts. So they were coming to the library and learning a little bit about gravity or about heart rates or whatever the topic might be, so that when they got to school, they weren't arriving unprepared. So this is very similar in a lot of respects to what libraries try and do with early literacy, making sure that all children are prepared to learn to read when they get to kindergarten. There's a lot of overlap in concept here in doing that with STEAM preparation. When it comes to access, I think one of the best things that we can do is offer plentiful and rich options. So what you can see on the screen here is just a PDF copy of one of the STEAM flyers for my library, the Skokie Public Library. We do have a STEAM space, and we focus a lot of programs in and around that space and the topic that's happening there. But if we think about access to STEAM opportunities as being a barrier, a particular barrier for underrepresented minority children and their families, then having 1 or 2 activities every once in a while isn't necessarily going to be very helpful, because what if they can't come that day? What if they have a sibling who has something else to do, or what if it happens to be parent-teacher conferences, or who knows what? Everyone has such busy lives that only having 1 or 2 programs, 1 or 2 options can be really prohibiting for people who, for whatever other reasons, may have additional barriers than children who are not considered underrepresented in these areas. And finally, when it comes to motivation, I think this is perhaps the most important, because if we see kids being motivated to participate in activities, that's when we see them developing their own interests. We see them wanting to pursue STEM or whatever areas that they have a personal interest in. So what we can do as libraries is make sure that when we are offering activities, that they're going to be motivating. And that means that these activities introduce children to new interests. It helps them to build upon existing interests. And it means that these activities are also relevant to their lives, so that if, for instance, you happen to live in a community where there are concerns about privacy or digital safety, then you're tying in programs that are going to touch on those topics, because that's what's relevant to the kids in your community. If it's relevant and it's interesting to them, they're going to be that much more motivated to continue to pursue, to continue to come to those programs, but then also to pursue those topics outside of just the library. So that was a lot of information to start off with, I recognize, and I feel like I was talking a lot, getting a little breathy there, so I apologize if that was a problem for anyone. But I wanted to see if there are any questions up to this point before we get to a little bit more, less of the theory and background and more of the practical.
Amy, there are no questions yet.
Okay, we can go ahead and get started with the practical then. So you have this background knowledge, and by all means you don't have to remember all of it. The things that are important to remember is that certain children are underrepresented, and as a public institution we should represent them to the best of our abilities. I think that about covers it. So how do you then begin to plan a STEAM program that's going to be equitable, that's going to provide adequate preparation, that's going to be accessible, and will also be motivating to the audiences that you're trying to target in your community? So I've got a number of different starting points you can think about, and what I will say, all of these starting points are echoed in the Building STEAM with DIA toolkit, which again I will mention a little bit later, and can share some resources for how to find it. But basically, when thinking about a program, I like to start with a general idea or concept that will get me started, and then I build around that concept or that framework. So when it comes to making sure you have diverse programming, one excellent way to begin is to start by building around diverse books. So I'm hopeful that a lot of you are familiar with the recent movement of We Need Diverse Books. So it started in May of 2014 and has been a pretty consistent presence at conferences and online since, calling for better representation of diversity in literature. And whether it's related to that movement or not, there has been a huge influx of really high quality, excellent materials that focus on different diverse aspects of just life. So you get to see perspectives from different people. You get maybe some more nuanced biographies than just another one about a male president. You're going to get biographies about historical figures, male, female, white, African American, all sorts of backgrounds that you might not have seen previously. So take a look in your collection and look at some of these books. There are a lot of beautiful brand new ones, and see what looks interesting to you or even what kids are finding interesting and checking out, and then figure out a way to build a program around that. A second starting point is that you, instead of starting with a book, you can start with your specific community. So every community is going to be different. I would venture to say that even within especially within, I think a lot of people throughout the United States kind of lump Texas as all one big thing, but big usually means a lot of different ways of doing different things, different populations. So think about your specific community, who the people are, and what they are interested in, and make sure to include those different cultural perspectives in whatever it is that you're doing. So as an example, I like to use a program of a former colleague who worked in New Mexico, and she herself was not a First Nations person. She was a white woman, but she worked in an area that served a Navajo reservation and had a lot of Navajo children who would come to her library, and wanted to make sure that, first of all, she educated herself about that culture and their traditions to make sure she didn't accidentally offend anybody by having a program on a topic that was kind of taboo. But then also made sure that if she was doing a program on, say, the moon, that she was going to have science, Western science, NASA type stuff, but she's also going to have cultural perspectives of her community reflected in that program. So a lot of times that can mean for us as the program creators that we are talking with cultural organizations within our communities. We are specifically reaching out to try and get representation of those different stories in our programs. So a third, again, is looking outward to your community first, is to bring in different professionals who have experience, and oftentimes, hopefully, they bring a passion with them as well. So here in Skokie, we have the Illinois Science Research Park, which has a number of different types of scientists and other STEAM professionals, and we work on bringing them in to be able to come and not only share a little bit about their, whatever it is that they do, their topic of research or of work, but also to talk about how they got involved in science or whatever discipline it is in the first place. So Skokie has the benefit of being a particularly diverse community with a lot of diverse professionals. So we do try and make a point of making sure that we're not just bringing in, for instance, white dudes in lab coats, because I don't know if you guys are familiar with this phrase that you cannot be what you cannot see. So if even me as a white woman, if all I ever see when we meet scientists is white men, then even if I'm not explicitly thinking to myself, well, men do that, can I do it? Like, that's what gets ingrained over time. So making sure that you're tapping the diversity of professionals in your community and bringing them in so that children are exposed to the variety of ways of being a scientist, being a STEAM professional, different ways of getting there, and the fact that Scientists can look like anybody and should look like anybody, that there's not just one way to be a scientist. So kind of taking a different approach then for the fourth starting point and thinking about diversity programming when it comes to STEAM is to really think about in whatever activities or projects you're going to offer, thinking about how you can involve children in doing the STEAM, so making it hands-on, making it interactive. Maybe you have some demonstrations, but then you have some experiments that they can participate in. So this starting point really ties back to that motivation crux that we want to think about. We want to make sure our programs are motivating. And if we can learn about volcanoes by watching a video, that's fine. Whatever, a kid who's already interested in volcanoes is probably still going to be. Maybe you'll get another kid interested, I don't know. But if you can get a kid or a group of children in a program doing some sort of activity, learning hands-on about volcanoes and explosions and different types of rocks, and they get to actually physically do it, that's a lot more powerful when it comes to giving kids motivating and interest-building experiences, because they're actually doing the science themselves. So our fifth diversity starting point, hopefully you maybe of those four we've talked about so far, one of them particularly stands out to you. If not, we've got four more, so hopefully one will click for you and you say, yes, I can do that. So the fifth is to designate a space in your library with activities that children can do at any time. So I see this a lot in libraries in particular that are understaffed or have a lot of part-time staff or have just a sufficient number of staff but have so many things to do, which, let's face it, that's a lot of libraries. So you can't always offer a ton of programs like that we talked about in wanting to make sure we provide lots of plentiful access to STEM opportunities. But what we can do is offer them in a more sort of passive capacity. So if you have a space in your library, it could be a table, it could be a cart. If you are really lucky, it could be a room or an old closet that you've cleaned out that you've turned into a room. But you can create a space, even if it's just a tabletop, to be able to offer ongoing STEAM activities. And what that means, regardless of what the actual activity is, by offering it in a designated space and offering it all the time, that means that families who, for whatever reason, find it a barrier to come to registered programs or programs that are only at a designated time on specific days, you're giving them the opportunities, those kids the opportunities to engage in the activities equitably the same as anyone else could, because they're available. If you are in the library, then this activity is available to you. So that can go a long way to cutting down a big barrier toward access in STEAM. So I encourage you to think kind of creatively where in your library you could have a little space. And like I said, it can be as much as a tabletop. I've seen a number of libraries, again, the specific example ties more closely to early literacy, but we'll take a table in the kids area, pretty small table, cover it in felt and turn it into an interactive felt board. It's just always available. So we can use that same sort of concept, same principle to offer STEAM spaces in our libraries. A sixth starting point, and this would potentially involve a little bit more planning and orchestration, is to figure out ways to engage the entire family in your programming. I see this a lot in my particular library, where we have about 40% of our service population who have not been born in the United States. There are a lot of immigrant families, multi-generational immigrant families, and they come to the library as an entire family. So offering a program just for fourth graders where the second grade sibling can't come too doesn't work. What we need to make sure we do is offer a family event where the entire family can engage together. This could be book discussions. A couple of years back, the Dia de los Niños, Dia de los Libros Children's Day Book Day from ALSC really focused on Dia family book discussions, which can be a great way to, again, tie in some of these fantastic books and to offer a program that's going to be engaging for the entire family, You can also do kind of festivals, which can be really popular, where you just have throughout the library maybe 3 or 4 different activities. Families can come, do all of the activities at their own pace, and really engage in the library and in the STEAM content together in ways that are really meaningful. And if you want to talk about things being motivating, think about a young child who gets to come to the library and with their older brother or sister or their parents or their aunt or uncle, they get to do these activities and get really involved and interested. Having that family support, that family reinforcement of pursuing these topics is really powerful in terms of motivating kids to become involved and stay involved in STEAM studies. Our 7th starting point is encouraging people to share their first-person experiences. Again, this is one where you're looking out at your community. You can have people tell their personal stories as it relates to STEAM experiences. We all have them, so you can go out and take a nature walk and have the children record the things that they found, why they noticed the things that they did, and kind of see how different people, even doing a similar thing, really engage in different ways, and how that's really cool, and why different ways of observing are a really great thing for science. So figuring out ways to encourage children to share their first-person experiences is really important. When it comes down to it, that's really what a science fair is too. It's one child sharing their experience with a science experiment with others. And I think there are ways we can replicate that sort of model with STEAM activities in the library that don't necessitate anyone having to buy one of those like tri-fold poster boards and make a science fair poster, which I still have occasional slight nightmares about, and that was in the 4th grade that I did that. So we can do this in a much more positive and motivational type way that encourages kids to not only do science but to share it with their peers. And finally, in terms of starting points for thinking about diverse STEAM programs, think about programs that you already offer, and I guarantee you're offering some cool programs right now that would be perfect for this, STEAM programs. Think about those existing programs, and then how can you make sure that those are accessible to another audience, targeting a specific audience who may be underrepresented in your community, or maybe considered underserved based on the research that I shared from 2011. So think about the people who are not engaging in your programs but who are part of your community and what you could do to make sure that they have access. It could be thinking about kids who are in after-school programs and working with that after-school program to bring a version of your program to their space. Could be translating your flyers into Spanish. It could be any number of things, but figuring out a way how to bring that new and untapped audience to your existing events. Do we have any questions up to this point, Christine?
Well, yes, Amy. Here is one question. Is Boombox a website? Or do you have it online?
Yeah, so the Boombox is the name of our STEAM space at the Skokie Public Library. And we do have information about it on the Skokie Public Library website. Our help site is not publicly available yet because it just hasn't been branded with our Skokie stuff. But our space, it was an old youth services office space just off of the youth department. It was storage, it was cleaned out. Maybe it was before my time that it was cleaned out, so I don't know if it was contentious or not. But it was turned into an interactive STEAM space. It is for all ages, but we focus specifically on grades 3 through 8 because that's where there's a lot of drop-off in science interest and education in our community. We wanted to make sure we were providing that those opportunities. And yeah, we change the theme that we're exploring every couple of months. So the flyer you saw was when we did big and small things with microscopes and telescopes. Over the summer we did gardening. We're in the middle of doing textiles right now. So lots of different ways you can do STEAM that's going to appeal to a lot of people in your community.
Okay, Amy, here's another comment, actually. The Tomas Rivera Mexican American Children's Book Award list is a good list of Texas authors who can be contacted to present a program about their writing.
That's an excellent comment, and not being from Texas myself, I wasn't aware of that one, but that's a great way to incorporate not only great books, but great local community members and those authors, and get some of that first-person sharing happening in your library. So thank you for sharing that.
And that is all of the questions we have right now.
Okay. If you think of any questions as we go through, again, feel free to type them in, and we will have more time to look at them a little bit later on. So for now, let's talk about some sample programs. I always love in presentations when there are sample programs, because if it sounds really interesting, I will write it down and then do it at my library. So hopefully these will seem interesting and applicable to you. So starting off with a program for preschoolers. This is one where you're exploring the concept of staying warm in the winter. It's about 20 to 30 minutes. In my experience, that seems to be the best for preschool age programs. If everyone's doing the activities together at the same time, we're more towards 30 minutes. If there's a self-paced component, then some kids finish in 20. Some kids can maybe stay for 40. Different levels of engagement, especially for different ages of preschoolers. So what we would do is start off by reading or telling some winter animal myths from different cultures. So this one here you can see on the screen is Rainbow Crow, and it is about a crow in the winter. So if we're exploring the concept of winter and how things stay warm, we want to look at different seasonal myths and stories or animal myths to be able to explore this concept. Two things I want to mention, so that I think for a lot of people the idea of using folk myths from traditions that are not specifically their own can be a little intimidating. So on the one hand, a really good tip if you're wondering if you should or should not use a book, if it is a good representation or not, is to look and see at the end if it has any source notes. Really, really good folktale picture books are going to include their source notes about where the story came from, as opposed to if it was, made up or bits and pieces filled in that maybe aren't accurate to the culture it came from. But also, don't feel like you need to find a story that ties 100% explicitly to your topic in every way, shape, or form. We could do the story of the mitten, which is about, a mitten that grows in size as everyone climbs inside of it. But we can use that, which is a really enjoyable story, and then talk about snow and talk about staying warm. We don't have to, have a topic and then make sure that the folk myth that we find touches on that topic exactly. It's within our power as the program leader to go ahead and make those connections with the kids. So from there, once we've enjoyed a couple of stories that touch on winter and different folk traditions on how seasons happen and why certain animals have maybe thicker fur or feathers to stay warm, what we're going to do is then experiment with staying warm. So we're going to look at some different types of things, materials that would help humans but also other animals stay warm, so like feathers, having wool. It's always good to have some mittens or a nice wool scarf or sweater to demonstrate. A lot of animals use fat or blubber to stay warm too, so you can have a nice lump of Crisco, which basically helps make that connection for kids. And what you can do is really test out the capacity for these different materials to insulate against the cold. So we've explored different dealings of cold and winter with our myths, but now we're going to do it using our own hands and sticking them into a bowl of ice water. But what we're going to do is have a big plastic bag, like a Ziploc bag, put some of the feathers in it, for instance, put another smaller Ziploc bag in and put your hand in the small Ziploc bag, dip that into the bucket of ice water, and we're going to see how warm those feathers keep your hand. You can try that by putting in cotton balls or unspun wool, or the Crisco is the one that gets kids really interested because, again, you have your big Ziploc, you put in a bunch of Crisco, stick in a smaller Ziploc, put a kid's hand in that small Ziploc and dip it into the ice water. And after a while, the Crisco will get cold, but it doesn't let a lot of coldness get from the ice water into your hand very quickly. So we get to learn how animal fat, or in this case, vegetable fat, is a really good insulator. So we're learning some great science concepts. We're tying it to different science and mythological explanations of seasons and winter. And we're having other titles like these on display so that kids and families can continue to explore the topic after the program. So looking a little bit older for kids in kindergarten through second grade, this age group is one that I think there's a big variety or big range in what a kindergartner can do versus what a second grader can do. So I try to have things that we can scaffold and they can be easier, but they can become more complex based on the abilities of the child. So in 30 or 45 minutes, we're going to talk about the color wheel. So that's going to be the science that we're talking about here. We've got the primary colors, red, yellow, blue. We've got secondary, orange, green, purple. We've got them arranged on the color wheel. We can see how they complement. So we've got that basic science. But then we're going to look at resources from different books, maybe from the internet, maybe from pieces of fabric that persons in your community are letting you use for this program. And what you're going to do is look at different patterns. A lot of times it's on fabric because people wear patterns, but also on maybe some other things in artwork or wherever there are patterns in a culture, and look at what these different patterns look like. Talk about the shapes that we see, talk about the colors that we see, and maybe start to identify how different areas of, do we see different parts of the planet have different preferences when it comes to the colors that they pair together? Why do we think that might be? Does it tie to what colors are available, in the plants and things they can use to dye fabric? Maybe it does. So we can start to see the huge variety of different patterns that come from a lot of cultural traditions across the globe. And then what we can do is let kids create their own. So this is some of that first-person aspect as well. So what patterns and colors were they really drawn to as they explored different patterns from across the world? And what are they going to design if it's entirely up to them? Again, this is an activity that can be very straightforward for a kindergartner, but can get a little bit more complex for a first or second grader who really wants to dig in and do something pretty complicated when it comes to creating a pattern. So we've looked at science of colors and shapes. The multicultural aspect is looking at patterns from different cultural traditions. And then we've got that first-person motivating aspect where kids are getting to take what they've learned and be creative in how they apply it. All right, an example of a program for third, fourth, and fifth graders is to look at candies of many cultures. This is a great one, perhaps now that we're coming up on Halloween. I always like to stock up on post-Halloween candy when possible. For this one, what you do in about 45 to 60 minutes, depending on how many kids you have and how much space and how many different candies you're going to have to taste. I like to start off by bringing in someone from the local food community, whether they are a cook or at a bakery or a pastry chef, or if you have a candy making company in your town, bring in a candy maker, but have that person to come in and talk about the science and the importance of taste. Why do we have some candies that are sweet and some that are sour? Why are those things important? Why do we pair different things together? So the science here is talking a lot about taste. The multicultural aspect is bringing in for kids to try not just the candies that they might be immediately used to, but lots of candies from around the world. So if you live in a particularly diverse community, my guess is that you're going to have access to some different different specialty grocery stores or food stores that would have some of the different types of candy enjoyed by persons in your community. But if you're looking for more variety, you can always, if you have access to a World Market store, that can be a good one, or everyone's best friend, Amazon, has a lot of different things that you can try. The one caveat I will say is do beware of food allergies because, as always, we want to make sure that everyone is able to enjoy our programs. Nobody goes into anaphylactic shock. So if you're going to do anything where you're tasting foods, make sure to have ingredient labels easily available so people can know what to avoid. So in terms of, having all of these candies, you can then taste them, have kids taste them, try and describe, is this one sweet? Is this one kind of salty? Does this have a fruit flavor? So trying to describe different tastes using some of that science vocabulary that one of the professionals, the baker, the candy maker has shared. And then also I'm getting kind of a geography science aspect here where you can take different types of candy and find on the map where they are from. And as you do that, maybe see if there's a particular tendency to prefer chocolate in a certain area or mango flavors or, who even knows what different types of candies you can find. But as you start to categorize and organize, you can start to see similarities and differences across all of the candies that kids are tasting. So those are some 3 sample programs. Any thoughts or questions on those before we wrap up with some resources and maybe final questions?
Amy, at this moment, there are no additional questions for you.
Okay. Well, hopefully some aspect of any of those programs seemed interesting to you. Again, the diversity components are making sure to draw stories or myths from different traditions into the programs to show different patterns from different cultures and to look at different flavor and food preferences from around the world.
Amy?
So, go ahead.
One question did come in. Excuse me. It says, do you do any kits for passive programming?
Do we do any kits for passive programming? So in my library, we do not have kits. Well, we're just starting to have kits that are sitting out all of the time, but we do have kits that can be checked out. So for instance, it would be some sort of machine or toy or something on a topic, for instance, a model that you can take apart or dissect of, very plastic and pretend looking of a human body, and it's going to have some human body books tied in or books that are going to help explore that concept. So those are things that families can check out and do at home. In terms of kits, in the library, we don't have a lot that's just out all the time, but we will have different things for building. So we'll have different blocks, we'll have puzzles, and if those are in a really static space where we know that they're always going to be, making sure that we have some sort of signage that not only explains what it is and asking people to help clean up when they're done, but also giving parents 1 or 2 sample questions of how they can engage their kid in talking about whatever that topic is for the activity.
That sounds great, and I just have a couple of comments. One is, I love the program ideas, especially the candy and patterns. Love the candy store idea. We have a store nearby that we can hopefully network with. And then a question has just come in. Do you have a list of virtual STEAM activities for parents and children?
I'm not entirely sure what is meant by virtual STEAM activities. Like for things that they can access online at home and be able to do. Whoever asked that question, if you can clarify a little bit, and I will see how best I can answer that.
And thank you. That is all the questions. Oh, wait, here he says online courses and webinars, etc.
Gotcha. So since I focus really on 5th grade and younger, we don't have much in the way of courses or webinars or things like that that are going to be a little bit more formal that we're talking about. When it comes to having programs around like the day of code or hour of code, we definitely will then make a recommendation of, hey, check out Scratch, which is a free online programming language, or check out the Hour of Code website or Khan Academy, and you can learn this thing. So we don't have like a landing page where we share all of those different opportunities, but if we have a program or an activity on a topic, we're going to, the same way that we share library books on that topic for further exploration, we're also going to share some of those online virtual resources too. What I will say is that we are in the process of starting with our Boombox STEAM space to have a YouTube channel that is about demonstrating an easy activity on whatever our current topic is that families can do at home or they can come into the space to do. So being able to physically come to the library is not a barrier to the activity. So for instance, I mentioned we're doing textiles right now, and one of the YouTube videos that should be coming out shortly is how to take a t-shirt, for instance an old summer reading t-shirt, and turn it into a library tote bag, just using scissors as your tool. So trying to promote interactive activities in that way. All right, so with just a little bit of time left, I want to go ahead and do our, I guess, kind of the 5 big takeaways for thinking about making sure your programs where you explore STEAM are diverse. So above all, make sure that any programs that you're going to offer, that they're going to be engaging and they're going to be participatory. Make it hands-on, make it interactive, let kids actually touch and do as opposed to just watch, because having those tactile experiences, not only does it help them better remember what it is that they're doing, it helps them to become more motivated to pursue other opportunities or to learn more. Just something about doing it that makes it all the more accessible. And aligned with that, make sure that your programs are motivating. If you're working with tweens, figure out what sorts of topics they're interested in and then create programs around those topics. Make it something that introduces them to new interests or builds upon existing interests and things that are relevant to their lives. So for instance, when we had some conversations in our community about a local waterway and the safety levels of the water, we did some programming where kids could test water quality. It was something that they were talking about in school, but also perhaps talking about at home. And so offering that type of program, it was intrinsically motivating because it was something that they cared about. Another tip is to make sure that you're highlighting diverse STEAM whenever you get the chance. That can be bringing in professionals. That can be, instead of just talking about, I don't know, who do we always learn about? Instead of just talking about Thomas Edison, making sure that we're talking about maybe people who are still alive and are scientists, maybe people who aren't just white men who are scientists, and being cognizant of not only talking about quote-unquote Western science, but also looking at different traditions, cultural traditions throughout history, where maybe in Native American night sky myths, they didn't have the exact same scientific or mathematical understanding of constellations that we do today because of the scientific instruments we have, but they did have a lot of wonderful stories to explain the basic scientific concepts that do hold up. So it's not just white lab coat modern day science, that there are lots of ways to look at science from throughout history and across different cultures. Use all of the resources that are available to you. It's going to be books in your library, it's going to be resources you find online, programs your colleagues at other libraries have done, and also individuals in your community. You do not have to be the expert in any of these topics to be able to offer a program. If you can bring in someone who is a legit day job expert in any of these topics, do it. That's a great motivating thing to be able to give to kids. And in line with that, tip number 5 is to create partnerships and collaborations. So think about who is in your community. Do you have a garden center? Do you have a stargazing group? I'm sure you probably learned if you had stargazing groups, if you saw anything in the last week about the supermoon and the eclipse and saw different community groups getting excited about observing that, learning more about that. So find who those groups are and invite them to come to your library, to be present, to offer programs, to work with you, host them and the program at the library. For instance, having a group bring their telescopes can be really outstanding. So look to what they're doing, in particular if they're doing something that you couldn't offer on your own, and work with them to see if there are ways that you can offer those things together. So last but not least, before we have time for a final question or two, a couple of resources I wanted to mention. So last year and this year, ALSC has focused Dia de los Niños, Dia de los Children's Day Book Day, there we go, on building STEAM and making sure it's diverse and accessible. So there were book lists that were out not too long ago, I think last spring. There's the Building STEAM with Dia toolkit that was forthcoming until very, very recently, so it is available now, yay. So if you are to search for Building STEAM with Dia on Google or on the ALSC website, you would be able to find it. It's got a ton more programming ideas, both things that I've done myself and folks who were able to get grants from Dollar General to offer Building STEAM with Dia programs. A lot of the stuff that I talked about today has specific program examples there. And if you're looking for new ideas, the Dia program registry is always a great place to look. That's where folks who are doing Dia programs, they can share those online for other people to see. School Library Journal has a STEAM board on Pinterest that always has lots of new activities. I pin the stuff to the board, but I don't create most of the content. I usually just find it, and there are tons of librarians across the country doing really cool STEAM activities, so there's always new stuff up there. And last but not least, again, look to your staffs and look to your customers. Find out what you have available to you, what the local interests are, what the local talent is, and bring those in and utilize those. They're a great resource. They're a never-ending resource, and they can be a great way to not only bring in something new, but to build a new audience in your library as well. Do we have any final questions? And I will say, if you think of a question later on or can't quite formulate it now, you've got my contact information here on the screen. Write it down. I'm happy to have anyone email me a question or comment, and I'm happy to respond.
Amy, I have a comment. Thank you all for the awesome presentation. I don't see any questions at this time. One might pop up. But for now, let me just thank you for sharing your knowledge about STEAM and DIA and informal learning designed to reach diverse children in our communities. And your experience is really valuable to all of us. And I enjoyed the fall colors and your presentation. Thank you for that. Would you like to make any closing remarks, Amy?
Sure. The biggest things I would have people take away is that recognizing that in our communities there are people who just don't have the access or preparation to succeed in STEAM like they might be able to do if they had more opportunities. And as public institutions, not only is it something that we should do, it's something that we can do, starting with existing programs all the way to creating new ones. There are lots of wonderful and engaging ways to bring kids from all backgrounds into STEAM and give them those opportunities to succeed in STEAM throughout their lives. So that's the charge for everybody. You can do this. It's going to be a benefit to your community, and it's probably going to be a lot of fun for you too.
Well, thank you again, Amy, and thank you to everyone who attended this webinar. Please watch your mailboxes. In about 2 days, you will receive a follow-up email with a statement of CE credit, a link to the recording of the webinar, and all other information that we have promised you. And as Naomi mentioned, the webinar that Amy presented earlier this month is also archived at the URL that was provided earlier. And I have a couple of more comments here, and just to thank you and say this was a good session. And so this concludes our webinar. And again, thank you, Amy, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much.